All right. Well, I think we should get going. We're right on the hour, and a lot of people have joined. Thank you for joining us tonight. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, John, and good evening, everyone. And I still see some people joining, but we're really excited to have you all here. My name is Stephanie Marshall-White. I'm one of many incredible volunteers who are here to help John Weston get reelected. I have worked with John. He actually gave me my first job on the Hill in Ottawa when I first started out in politics. So I've known him for a really long time, and I've known what a great not only parliamentarian he is, but a really great person. And especially in this week of reflection, I think it's really important to have those people representing us who can take that time for reflection and for deeper thought. And that's what we're here for tonight. We're here to dive into the subjects a little bit more. And I'm really excited to be joined by, such a great group of panelists tonight. And I know John's really excited for the discussion. So without further ado, John Weston.
Thank you, Stephanie. And it is really cool to think of your legacy working in Parliament Hill, where you did such a great job. And you're right, volunteers make civics work and certainly make politics work. So thank you. Well, thank you for joining us, everybody. Tonight is the 7th and the final episode of this season of our Things That Matter series. And I don't know how it happened, but it seemed that every topic got more relevant and every conversation more compelling as we went along. We dealt first with national health and fitness, and then moved to national security, foreign affairs, environment, the economy, and with Aaron O'Toole about promoting good leadership. If you missed the live broadcast, you can still catch up by looking at the recordings on the website, johnweston4mp.ca. And as you're already getting the picture, I think through Stephanie's introduction, the character of the conversations was to introduce lively, fresh discussion. So yes, I am involved in an election contest, but I wanted this Things That Matter series to be about ideas, about things that really matter to the people in our riding and our country. And certainly tonight's topic suggests that we hit the mark in terms of relevance. One thing I lament is when people in politics take polarized positions and refuse to listen to one another. On both the left and the right, such persons contribute to this dirge that our institutions have failed and must be torn apart. They can become immune to reason and forsake any signs of progress, and often express their views more loudly than the moderates. Canadians who tend to be characterized by tolerance, compassion, ingenuity, curiosity, and generosity are the ones that I think of as the moderates. And they come to the table with a lack of passion sometimes that suggests the only persons who feel strongly about the goodness of our country are the extremists, who tend to be hypercritical of our country and its institutions. Personally, I don't fall into the camp of people on an extreme side of the things that matter we've discussed in this series. I desperately want a flourishing, sustainable environment, but cannot abide the destruction of our energy sector. I'm an advocate of civil liberties who seeks reliable national security. I'm the scientific Christian, the green Tory, and the biking conservative. I don't fit neatly into the boxes used by political pundits. Knowing many people in our audience tonight, I'm willing to bet most of you don't either. My hope in developing this Things That Matter series was to ensure that open-minded moderates like us have a refreshing forum in which to explore views with the help of acknowledged experts to guide the conversation. And you're going to hear from some of those this evening. I welcome you to let me know how well you think we've done in reaching our goals. And by the way, our guests do not, by appearing on our show, necessarily commit to support any particular politician or political party. This week's edition of Things That Matter touches on some very deep personal convictions as we tackle the topic pursuing equality and excellence. And we're fortunate to have a curious audience like the one we have tonight, and also fortunate to have 3 great guests, each of whom commands an impressive national profile, whom I will have the pleasure of introducing shortly. I hope that audience members will, as usual, provide a steady stream of questions, which I will field from the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. In terms of equality, I'm deeply committed to a unified sovereign nation under one universal law that applies equally to all people, regardless of race, color, creed, or linguistic background. Such equality of opportunity, I believe, unleashes a bold journey of excellence in which our best and brightest are free to thrive and in turn to develop their gifts for the betterment of our community, our country, and the whole world. Such a nation could live up to the promise envisioned by Martin Luther King, where people are judged not by the color of their skin, but the merit of their character. Fulfilling King's aspiration takes commitment, time, and yes, to reflect his theme, character. Nelson Mandela's biography is entitled Long Walk to Freedom, which suggests it takes discipline and long-term vision to develop a nation on the basis of the equality of opportunity. What I've observed in current national leadership is a stark absence of those traits. Instead, we see sporadic responses to immediate concerns that exhaust the nation's resources to achieve transitory goals. The result? A country with a patchwork quilt of laws which differ based on people's race, background, language, or other characteristics. Achieving true equality of opportunity for all people in Canada may indeed take decades, and we need to work through compensation and reconciliation. I believe Canadian tenacity will prevail. We will outgrow the divisions that preoccupy us now. We will grow into the great potential that beckons us, and we will over time continue to be the country that attracts people of all races, creeds, and languages to our shores. Before we go further, I want to acknowledge the anguish experienced by Canadians these past few days as we learned of the mass grave revealed in Kamloops. Those children died in part because of a system that insisted on treating them differently due to their race. If Canada then lived under one universal law that applied equally, the people and institutions would never have tolerated the treatment suffered by those children or the obscurity of their deaths. What is the right response to this revelation? Well, that's a really personal question for each of us today. So I was thinking, as flags fly at half-mast this week around Canada in honor of those children, maybe we could just take a moment of silence in our own ways to remember them. So if you'll bear with me, let's just do that now. Well, thank you. And I know we'll all have more time to reflect on what's unfolding in Kamloops. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first guest. He's been recognized as a business leader. In 2012, he was appointed as the inaugural chair of the Aboriginal Business and Investment Council. He served as a Haisla Nation chief counselor. In BC provincial politics, our guest was elected in 2017 as the MLA for Skeena, which he serves to this day. Under the past Liberal government, he served as Minister of Natural Gas Development and Minister responsible for housing. He recently declared his intention to seek the leadership of the BC Liberals, which means he could be the next premier of our province. It gives me great pleasure to introduce someone with vision for our province and our country. People, please welcome Ellis Ross.
Thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. And I thought a lot about what I was going to talk tonight, given the tragedy that unfolded in Kamloops, but I figured I better just stick to the plan in terms of what I agreed to talk to in the first place. And it's all encompassing anyway, when we're talking about the issues that Aboriginals face in Canada. And when I got into council in 2003, I was already well aware of the narrative of First Nations wanting to be independent, self-sustaining, self-determining. I already knew that. But when I got into council, I found out pretty quickly those were just buzzwords. It was just rhetoric, because there was no real clear plan or definition to what those words actually meant, let alone any type of implementation. And so I was stuck there for a while. And so I started reading as much as I could in terms of how to become independent, self-governing. And I quickly realized treaty negotiations wasn't the way to go. That's not a true form of self-government. And so I was fortunate in 2004, the Haida court case on a duty to consult and accommodate had come down. And we had a chief and council that truly believed that the principles of case law were the way to go in terms of getting government and industry to our table to negotiate meaningful agreements. Underneath that, on a few occasions where we had limited success, getting our people into employment, I noticed a change with a few people. One year we were successful in getting 3 of our band members jobs in industry, but I noticed the change in those 3 individuals. They weren't interested in alcohol. They weren't interested in wasting money. They were interested in saving money, buying trucks. They were talking about an unimaginable dream of owning a house through a mortgage instead of IndyNAC funding. And so I just thought, maybe there's something there. Maybe I should pursue that more. And the more we got engaged with industry, the more I saw it take place. And now I'm proud to say my community, if it was a 10-step process to be independent, we're in step 8. We're no longer talking about poverty. We haven't had a suicide in our community for the last 5 years. We're not talking about the welfare list. I mean, there's no more house parties in my community. And I don't know what the reason for that is. I have no idea. The social issues have seemed to solve themselves. Mind you, drugs is a different issue. But what I wanted to talk to you today about was the idea of self-governing for those First Nations that don't have the luxury of opportunity. Because our opportunity came from location. We're very wealthy or well off because of LNG and to a lesser extent forestry. But for those First Nations that don't have the opportunity, there's a way to actually get them ready for self-governing. And that's through the paternalistic funding agreements that actually Ottawa implements on every First Nation across Canada. If First Nations are truly screaming for independence and self-governance, then they've got to understand that comes with responsibility and liability. And I think there's a safe way to provide this through a funding agreement. If you don't know how it happens right now, a funding agreement given to a First Nation is prescribed. Every dollar is told to the First Nation on how to spend it. And if you come out with a surplus, they punish you. If you come out with a deficit, they punish you. And it's always with clawbacks. I just think that, okay, if First Nations are really asking for the paternalistic attitude to go away, then actually give the funding to them and actually let them set out the mandates. Let them set out where the responsibility lies in terms of where they spend their money and based on the needs of what their community members want and their band members. I think this is a great way to explore in a safe way what it really means to be self-determining, because everybody that's in government knows there's a tremendous amount of responsibility. And even for the fact of government getting sued, which happens all the time, that will happen with the First Nation when they start to get control of their own lands. This might sound simple, but it's not. I've been asking for it for quite a number of years, but I just haven't had the audience. And I think it's time. I think it's time. And I know there's a lot of people going to question it, but it's certainly better than trying to bring some type of amendment or an abolishment of the Indian Act, because the people that will be front of the line to actually oppose that will be Aboriginals themselves, which is ironic. The Indian Act is actually one of the biggest limiting factors to First Nations over the last 100 years. But if you try to amend it or abolish it, the Aboriginals will oppose it. And that's even if anybody's read it or understands it. To me, the Indian Act is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. In the face of opportunity and Aboriginal rights and title case law, it just doesn't matter, except if you're dependent on the funding agreement that comes with it. It's what's happened in my community. We're living the life here. We're enjoying the benefits of jobs, and we're not looking back. But I think there's different ways to actually get the other First Nations across Canada to get ready for the same day when they can say, yes, we're independent, but we're still within the confines of Canada. We're still citizens of Canada, BC, or whatever province they're in. Thanks, John.
Wow. Well, I don't know about the rest of our audience, but I've got lots of questions. Ellis, thank you. Thanks for being with us. And hang on, because we've got some questions coming at you. Let's go, though, to our other panelists, so our audience gets to meet everybody before we get into the questions. And this next introduction is both very personal and very professional. Joanna Barron is the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. And I can say with a certain amount of confidence that this is an organization that fights for individual Canadians whose rights are threatened by overreaching governments. And I can say that with confidence because Mark Milke and many others and I had a hand in launching the organization way back in 2002. And maybe your first question to you, Joanna, should be, what were you doing in 2002 when we were doing that? But that would maybe just embarrass Mark and me. So you don't have to answer that. Joanna, the organization has grown dramatically since we got it going and exceeded everyone's expectations. It's amazing what you're doing. In terms of further personal background, it's intriguing that you were the founding director of the Runnymede Society, which I understand encourages law students across Canada to stand up for individual liberties. You're a native of Toronto, and thank you for joining us late Toronto time tonight. You studied classical liberal arts at St. John's College in Maryland and earned civil and common law degrees at McGill University, which is a very tough combo. You clerked at the Court of Appeal for Ontario and were called to the bar in Ontario in 2013. But that's not all. You also worked in barristers' chambers in London as a Harold Fox Scholar, practiced criminal defense law, and you've appeared at all levels of court in Canada. So amazing background. And I heard you speak in the last 2 days on another topic entirely, Bill C-10. I can't wait to hear your remarks tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. And it's been an honor to, one thing that you didn't mention is that, well, you did mention you were instrumental in the founding of the CCF when I was in high school. So thank you for setting up my would-be future job. Teenager me thanks you for that. But one of the things that you didn't mention was that the case that you were very involved in, that was a bit of a history reconnaissance for me, which I thought I would talk about a bit because it's very important. And the reaction of the courts to the case, I think, resonates today very much in terms of our current discourse around Indigenous people in Canada and reconciliation. So if you'll permit me, I'll just talk a little bit about the case called Chief Mountain, why I think it's relevant, and a few other remarks about how this is actually kind of echoing in different parts of Canadian constitutional discourse. So briefly, the Nisga'a Nation in British Columbia came to a final agreement with the BC government in year 2000, where they established their own constitution, but not just their own constitution, but a citizenship, a police force, a judiciary. And this was not a case of power being delegated to it by either the provincial or the federal government. The Nisga'a government is actually a quasi-sovereign state residing within Canada with indeed the ability to pass laws that supersede Canadian law. So in this entity, Canadian laws are not applicable. Now, a Nisga'a ancestral chief named James Robinson, or his hereditary title is Chief Mountain, along with other Nisga'a people, challenged this as creating a third order of government, and asked the courts to strike down the treaty for non-compliance with the Constitution. So a very basic fundamental complaint. This creates a new state within Canada, and we no longer enjoy the basic rights and privileges of being Canadian. In addition, for Chief Mountain, the treaty was not a good deal. His family lost about 92% of the hereditary lands were surrendered to the government in this deal. And he said, what does Chief Mountain mean without the mountains? And so in at least 14 areas of lawmaking, if Nisga'a law conflicted with Canadian or provincial law, Nisga'a law would prevail. So a bit about Canadian law. Our constitutional framework dates back, of course, to 1867, when the BNA Act set out legislative powers delineated between the federal level in Section 91 and the provincial level in Section 92. And this agreement vested Nisga'a officials with new powers. And the obvious threat that came up, as I think you can see in the case of Chief Mountain, observing that most of his personal ancestral laws were surrendered, was that people outside of the favor of the government, favor of the individuals, of course, not the whole nation, but who negotiated this deal, was that they could become quite marginalized and vulnerable very easily. And normally the remedy for people being deprived of their rights in Canada is the protections of the Constitution. And since 1982, the Charter of Rights, which sets out the right to equality, to due process, to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, but they also would be deprived from even human rights codes. And all of this is justified by allowing the rights to be dealt with internally, so to speak. And so it's important to note at this juncture that Chief Mountain, or James Robinson, was not at all opposed to Aboriginal self-government or treaties, even less so of encouraging a context for Aboriginal culture, values, prosperity to bloom. He, from his perspective, and from the case and from the legal perspective, self-government and treaties, as well as Canadian constitutional protections, should not be mutually exclusive. And this is, of course, in part what the work of reconciliation is about. And we obviously have a ways to go towards this end. So I'll just briefly mention that this principle of different levels of government sort of popping up is not just confined to the Indigenous context. The Canadian Constitution Foundation had an interesting case this past summer where a town in Nova Scotia, way on the other side of the country of you guys, called Yarmouth, decided to pass a bylaw that took the extraordinary measure of banning all election signs in the town in the lead up to their municipal election. So no signs allowed at all. And the alleged rationale was to reduce visual clutter as well as waste, even though, you know, a homemade wooden sign would still be permitted. But of course, its likely effect would be to just strongly favor better known incumbents. And luckily, we sent a strongly worded letter to the town and laid out the application of the Constitution and how they do have certain powers under the municipality, but not to the exclusion of the Constitution. And they decided to not enforce this particular rule. But getting back to Chief Mountain and the Niska Nation, reconciliation, I think, between the federal government and provincial governments and Indigenous peoples is absolutely one of the most pressing issues in Canada. It includes regeneration, forgiveness, honest reckoning with the horrors in the past and the total derogations from the rule of law and our liberal values, which are obviously underscored by the horrifying discoveries of this week. And self-government, I believe, is also an important goal. But I believe that we should look at sovereignty of the Crown, of Canadian sovereignty, not as alienated from Indigenous people, but a goal that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people should mutually form. Indigenous scholar John Borrows describes reconciliation as not being a zero-sum game where every instance of diversity or difference is a deprivation of sovereignty, but instead it's upholding the sovereign interests of Canadians as a whole, including Indigenous peoples, is not to deny constitutional space for Indigenous peoples as members of distinct cultures, but recognizing this as a living relationship. And fundamentally, the question is whether or not we believe sincerely in the vision of human dignity, equality, and freedom guaranteed to all by the Constitution Act in 1867 and the Charter, as well as our country's underlying principle of peace, order, and good government. And I realize this is sort of out of vogue, but I still do believe in that project. And if so, we have to encourage our mutual flourishing, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, which is buttressed by the rule of law and the Constitution. Thank you, John.
I am so excited, Joanna, to hear somebody wax eloquent about the Constitution. It used to be that only Americans could do that. And here you are taking it to the law schools, taking it to people even younger than you, that our Constitution matters, sovereignty matters. So what a great pair of presentations. And I hope you all can see that there's some unity there and there may be some inconsistency. So we're gonna come back to those things in just a second. I should, by the way, mention the Canadian Constitution Foundation is a charity that depends on donations from people like us. So let's go to you, Mark Milke. Dr. Mark Milke, public policy analyst, keynote speaker, author, columnist. I'm sure you've read his articles in the Globe and Mail and the National Post. Also already mentioned, he has a link to the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Not a surprise, because he's someone who really cares about the goodwill of Canadians and someone with a real long-term vision that typically is associated with constitution making. He's published 6 books. You know, having published 1 book, I can just doff my cap. I don't know how you could get 6 books and still carry on a life, Mark. And as well as dozens of studies across Canada. His newest book is called The Victim Cult, and the whole title is How the Culture of Blame Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilization. It's an Amazon bestseller. It hasn't been out that long. Lately, Mark was the lead architect of the United Conservative Party election platform and principal policy advisor to the UCP's leader, Jason Kenney. Incidentally, if you didn't read it, Jason had a front page article on in the National Post today that is very much in line with our theme this evening about nation building. Mark's commentaries have appeared, well, all over the place. I mentioned the Globe and Mail, National Post, Maclean's also runs his work. He's born in our very own province of BC in Kelowna. He lives in Calgary, and I'm hoping he's an active supporter of the Canadian Health and Fitness Institute as a hiker, skier, runner. He also has interest in architecture, photography, cities, and history. Mark, you've got to live up to that very eclectic and intriguing resume this evening. Over to you.
Well, I think the answer, John, is that I have no life. That's why I'm able to write 6 books. But thank you. Good to see you, Joanna and Ellis. Ellis was kind enough to write the foreword to The Victim Cult. So it's good to see everybody. Let me jump right into it. When John asked me to talk about equality and excellence, I mean, I'm thinking, okay, you know, it might be easier to describe the inner workings of the 1905 Russia-Japanese War than to get into equality and excellence and sum it all up in 6 minutes. But let me try my best, John, for that tall ask that you've given. Let's jump into excellence. What is it? Well, I think I'll define it. You know, you want a good education, you want a decent career, you want an income. The ancient Greeks talked about the good life, which involved family. It involved having some money so you could do some things other than just, you know, survive. There's a lot to excellence. Now, on to equality. So if you think of the good life in every possible way, right? Good health, the rest of it, there's a lot to excellence. But where does equality come into all of this? Well, I think we have to define what equality is. Otherwise, you know, it, like many terms, it just becomes amorphous. Somehow we're in favor of equality, but what does that mean? Well, for me, and I think what history has shown is that the worst, you know, crimes or the tragedies in history have occurred when individuals are not respected as individuals. So let me get into that a little bit. For me, equality is not about equality of groups or outcomes, right? The 20th century was all about attempts by, you know, Marxists to get to equality of outcomes economically, which for a whole bunch of reasons was, you know, false at the start and ended badly. But what is equality really about, or why is it worth something? Well, equality should be about, in my view, moral equality of the individual. People forget or never know that many societies around the world, historically, including our own, if you go back, you know, pre-2000 years ago, had no notion of the individual. The individual didn't matter in Greek society or Roman society. What mattered was the collective, the family or the city-state, the city of Athens. And the only people that mattered in a family mattered not because they were individuals, but because they headed the family. So the male or the firstborn son, but the wife didn't matter. The other children didn't matter. There was no conception of the individual. And a tremendous development, wonderful development over the last 2 millennia has been the growth of the understanding that the individual exists and she has a conscience and a right to that conscience. So moral equality of the individual, equality of the individual in law and policy. I'm not a big fan of any detour from equality in law and policy from the individual. Let me give you one clear example from Canada. Quebec has long had a problem, I would assert, treating individuals equally. John Diefenbaker fought the Quebec government, I believe it was in the 1950s or 1940s, on how they treated Jehovah's Witnesses. We know that Quebec has had to use parts of the Constitution to enforce discrimination against English speakers, and is doing so again against Muslim women who would like to wear the hijab. I'm utterly opposed to departures from equality of the individual as the center of law and policy. And I'm utterly in favor of equal opportunity for the individual. Where do we get into trouble? I think we get into trouble when we try and, as I mentioned a moment ago or hinted at, prescribe equal outcomes by looking at groups or comparing groups and wondering why there are differences when you get into statistical analysis. Why does this matter? Because sometimes governments will use policy to try and enforce equal outcomes as if, again, a la the 20th century, that's a desirable end. It's not. The Black economist Thomas Sowell has written perceptively on this, and I don't know, dozens of books and works over the years, but he had an interesting comment in one of them, that people and families don't end up in any equal place because of all sorts of different factors. Why would we expect groups, when you measure them, when you take 1 million people and measure them against another 1 million people, that somehow you would have exactly equal outcomes? It's a chimera because there's differences in economies, education, geography, cultural differences. So I think the key is to focus on equality of opportunity for the individual, equality of the individual in law and policy, moral equality, again, an introduction into human thinking 2 millennia ago and beyond, but not before. And that's an important distinction to make. Okay, why does this matter? If you focus on the wrong thing, you're not going to get the outcome you want. And what I mean by this, and it's another example that Thomas Sowell points to, he notes, for example, that Italian fishermen, at least historically, when he wrote a couple of decades ago in this one, dominated the fishing industry, not just in the Mediterranean, where you might expect, given the location of Italy, but in Argentina and Australia, or at least immigrant Italians did. Now, why is that? Well, if you compare to Swiss, someone might compare the Swiss writ large with Italians writ large as fishermen and say, there must be some discrimination happening because of the difference in outcomes between the proportion of Swiss involved in the fishing sector in Argentina and Australia, or even the Mediterranean, and the Italians. But of course, there's a simple economic or geographic reason why there's a difference in outcomes. The Swiss are landlocked. You wouldn't expect a lot of Swiss to be great fishermen. So it's much better to focus on, is there some discrimination or something happening against individuals that's wrong, and focus on that. If you focus on groups, you may get led down a rabbit trail, as in the Italian-Swiss example, on why are they not equal in outcomes, or why is an exact percentage of each population not fishermen. Why does this matter? Well, when you focus on the individual, and especially, look, I do a lot of analysis. In my book, I do analysis. In my policy, I've done analysis. And I often see that people will mistake. They'll take averages, and they'll make a great many mistakes. And politicians, no offense, John, will often do this as well, and journalists do this. They will look at an average statistic and then draw all sorts of conclusions which are unwarranted. Instead, it helps to look at individuals versus individuals and apples to apple individuals, if I can put it that way. And the reason for that is then you can see actually where some progress is being made. Let me give you one clear example. In my book, I wanted to get at, again, sort of what's driving some of the statistics, including between First Nations and other Canadians. But what I found was a very encouraging statistic, and it's this. If you do, again, an apple-to-apple comparison between young adults between the age of 25 and 34, you'll find that Indigenous young adults who have a bachelor's degree or higher, who work full year full-time, have actually the same income as non-Indigenous adults across the country that have a bachelor's degree or higher, work full year full-time. In fact, the Indigenous young adult in that cohort I just mentioned will make $100 more, $43,445, literally about $99 higher than the non-Indigenous person with the exact same characteristics. That's an apple-to-apple comparison. I bring it up because it's important to understand sometimes what drives average statistics. In this case, 60% of First Nations people in the country live in a rural area. We know rural incomes are lower than urban incomes. That explains part of the disparities when you look at average statistics. But the statistic I just mentioned, the apple to apple comparison, is actually encouraging. Why? Because it's got nothing to do with how you look, where you came from, who your parents are, none of that. What matters is geography. They likely went to university in an urban setting, and they're likely working in an urban setting now with a bachelor's degree or higher, and therefore they have a great income. Here's the thing, geography and education are changeable. None of us can change our ancestry or bad breaks or good breaks and the rest of it. But when you do these apple to apple comparisons, you find, look, this is where you find out whether there's something going on wrong or whether you need a kind of a deeper or more precise dive into, certain problems. When you focus on the individual, then you can start to think, okay, as Ellis mentioned earlier, what I loved about that example was they figured out, look, we've got an economic problem here. And as it turned out, fixing, in their particular instance where they could, taking advantage of their location was tremendously helpful because it helped solve some of these other problems, right? And to me, that's actually linking proper cause and effect. So, yeah, let me end it on that. I mean, I think there's been great progress in Canada. I'm not sure that's always recognized. But for me, when you talk about excellence, I think it has to be, okay, why is this individual not doing well? We've got to be very careful not to generalize out from that. But certainly in terms of equality based in the individual, equality of opportunity, but not outcomes for groups, a la the Italian and Swiss fishermen. But certainly equality of rights and law and policy and equality of opportunity in every possible sense. That's what you want to work towards. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. And one theme I saw in all those presentations was, again, a pulling from the two opposites. So, Joanna, for instance, you said that Chief Mountain's perspective, and I thought this was a really important point, is that self-government and citizenship are not mutually exclusive. And Ellis, you were talking about, get ready for self-governing. First Nations are screaming for that independence. They want the freedom to expend these resources that are being transferred without the over-regulation. It's not inconsistent or mutually exclusive to be supported and still be British Columbia residents, Canadian citizens, and you live it. I mean, you're a representative in the Legislative Assembly. So let me put this to the three of you. To what extent do we get wrong-footed by people who say it's all about citizenship, or it's all about self-government, or it's all about the freedom to expend taxpayers' resources without regulation, and not understand that it's really about a little bit of both, maybe? Mark, why don't you take a stab at that? I'm going at the polarization that sometimes characterizes the conversation around equality, and then we'll go Joanna and then Ellis.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there, John. I feel like it'd be easier to get into explain the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, but
that's the next webinar.
Yeah, exactly. Webinar 8. Okay. Look, well, I would reframe the question. I guess part of the question is a problem for me. When it comes to public policy, I mean, I'm after, what's the source of the problem? What's the proper cause and effect link here? And then getting to the answer, and then how do you implement that? It doesn't matter to me whether someone describes them as right or left. To me, what I want to find out, let me put it another way. Often again, in media and politics, you'll have this discussion of what's the centrist moderate position, and you use some of that language. I think that may be a bit of a trap, honestly, because one person says 2 + 2 = 6 and describing a problem, and another, and a remedy, and another person says 2 + 2 = 4. Therefore, the moderate centrist position is 5, which is, of course, absurd. I think when it comes to First Nations reserves and self-government, look, I mean, there are unintended consequences, and part of that is, I mean, I'd be interested in hearing. I mean, Ellis has thought a lot more about this than I think probably most of us. So I'd be interested in hearing Ellis's answer on this. My concern, I'd like to get rid of the Indian Act, but then, there are a whole bunch of reasons why I'd like that. simply transferring a chunk of money to a First Nations government, I think is problematic, because I think power corrupts, money with power corrupts even more absolutely. So maybe the better remedy is to transfer the money directly to people on First Nations reserves, yet at the same time, have a certain tax portion of that transferred to the First Nations government, because then it creates a bottom-up accountability to that First Nations government. Absent that, look, I just think we have to be realistic about human nature. I'm not romantic about human nature, and I don't care if you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. Human beings bleed the same red blood, and human beings love power, and they get corrupted by money. And I don't care who you are. So I think when you think about these things, I don't care if you're an American founder or an Indigenous person now thinking about how to construct a First Nations reserve, or a federal politician, or you're going to be again, John. I mean, I think the key thing is to think about how human beings act.
Okay, interesting. And some of your comments make me think of Steven Pinker's recent book, Enlightenment Now, where he talks about humanism and the importance of the individual being a real good legacy of progress. Joanna, can you come back to this thought? I was so intrigued to hear you say self-government and citizenship not mutually exclusive. Can we do both? And is that the Canadian way? Is that where we're going?
I'm not sure if that's where we're going, but I think certainly all of us have overlapping identities, right? I'm a Jewish woman. My family are, Holocaust survivors. I'm Canadian. I'm Torontonian. All of us have overlapping identities. And so I think that people are capable of holding multiple identities. And I would imagine, like Mark was saying, we're all human. I would imagine Indigenous people are much the same way. I know that a few instances came up in the Nisga'a Nation already in the first few years after their agreement came into place. So, for example, there was a fisherman who was denied a fishing license, purportedly based on his opposition to certain individuals in government. And he brought a case for wrongful discrimination under the BC Human Rights Code. And the first offense raised by the Nisga'a government was lack of jurisdiction. So in other words, their position was that the Nisga'a people don't enjoy the protections of the provincial human rights code, and presumably not the charter either. And I think that's wrong. I think anywhere, like Mark said, humans are humans, governments become corrupt, people have biases, and the brilliance of a constitution, which is a document that we entered into, democratically and was negotiated democratically, is that it's a correction mechanism for wrong-headed decisions that get made. And so I absolutely do see the benefit of self-determination and self-government and making decisions for the community when you're closer to that community on issues of, municipal resources and schools and education. But I also think that there should be a baseline backstop at the very least of constitutional protection. So I don't see that as mutually exclusive.
You take me back to the Empire Club in Toronto, your hometown, where Chief Mountain spoke. It was the 100th anniversary of the Empire Club. And he said, it's my first visit to Toronto. I'm nervous, but I have a message. I believe we should be able to walk forward arm in arm as Canadians. And above all, I am Canadian. And, he closed very short remarks. My remarks alongside were much longer. I had spent, I think, 25 drafts. He just stood there and with his headdress on said to this crowd of well-heeled Torontonian business and professional leaders, I am Canadian. And who got the standing ovation? Chief Mountain. Ellis. So the question again is, is it possible to work through these things without finding great conflict? You were speaking about an innovative way of gaining independence. I think freedom from the Indian Act without necessarily abolishing the Indian Act. But how do you see bringing these things together?
Well, I can only tell you what I did. I was a counselor for 8 years before I became chief counselor. And I learned all the false narratives. I learned that I didn't want treaty negotiations. I learned the Indian Act was irrelevant and useless. I learned rights and title case law was fair to all three parties, meaning First Nations, the Crown, and the private sector. Um, but really, the goal was, number one, when you're talking to a First Nation, one of the things that was pointed out to me was we had no focus. And so I looked at our list of projects that we had in the books, 21 projects. Plus you're dealing with the Indian Act programming. Plus you're dealing with trade negotiations. Plus you're dealing with somebody spit out their gum on the sidewalk out front. And so I brought those down to 3 priorities. And that was, no, we're going to go with economic development. We're going to train our people. And plus, while we're at it, I'm going to actually fix our government system. So the day that I became chief counselor, I just changed offices. I walked into the boardroom and we're all sitting around the boardroom table, counsel, lawyers, consultants, and we're not even on the record. And the consultant looks at me, he says, okay, what do you want to do? And I just said point blank, I want to tear it all down. I want to burn it to the ground. Everything that we've done in the last 8 years no longer exists. You guys are going to follow my rules from now on. And number one, we're going to get rid of this Indian Act style council. We're going to segregate all those Indian Act programs over there and let 3 people of our council administer it in terms of making sure that we're doing our reporting, we're doing the compliance stuff. That's their job. None of that should come to our council table. The rest of you, you're going to come over here and you're going to learn about rights and title. You're going to help me negotiate all these agreements. You're going to help me deal with government and all these different rights and title issues. And that's how we're going to get successful in a short time. And it worked.
Interesting.
I know the council today, though, is going back to the old system. But I thought this was going to lead to a Maid and Heisler approach to governing that didn't take into consideration the hereditary leadership, didn't take into consideration the Indian Act. It was just basically what I witnessed in terms of Canada and BC. How come they have continuity? How come they have corporate memory? How come they never skip a beat when it comes to election? Whereas me, I got to start all over every 2 years at an election. And that's the way we became successful. It was one of the components that's missing in a lot of First Nation communities across Canada.
That's you've jammed a lot in a short time in recounting that episode, and I'm guessing a lot of people in the audience would like to learn more about that. So maybe you can let us know where you've written about that. But while you're thinking about that, I want to refer to the question of one of the most civic-minded persons I know in our audience. He currently heads up the Churchill Society. He's a prominent, his practice as a prominent lawyer internationally and business person. His name's Christopher Hebb. And Christopher asked the question, he says, look, how are people being held back, do you think, Ellis, by the property ownership regimes on reserves in terms of their being able to get value from their property and gain the independence that comes with equality?
Well, tough question. They are and they aren't. We know that home ownership actually adds a lot to pride, maybe investment, but we're still in a generation of people that view buying a house as a home. They don't view it as an investment opportunity. But mind you, there are mechanisms in place now, with or without the Indian Act, where a council can come to a bank and say, look, this is reserved land, we can't alienate it, but we will undersign every single mortgage you guys approve for our band members to build a house on reserve. And the younger generation is coming in and saying, yeah, we'd love to get that mortgage. The beauty of this is that the council is no longer managing social housing and actually having that liability on their books. And by the way, I opposed the idea of fee simple ownership in terms of parceling up our reserve lands, because I went to other First Nation communities across BC, and what I noticed was a lot of the poor, uneducated natives didn't have land because they sold their land to educated, wealthier natives. That's taking advantage of a vulnerable population within the First Nation community. So the point I was making to my council, say, look, there's got to be a way to protect, the natives that don't understand the value of land. And until we come up with those protections, I will never support this. I don't want the poor Indians in my community to get even poorer and poorer and poorer. And at some point, their generation descendants don't have land. And so they throw out the concept altogether because they couldn't figure out how to protect land from, let's face it, corruption.
So Ellis, let me ask the question that obviously arises from that. What's the difference between an Indigenous person and a non-Indigenous person who is uneducated, a landowner, and subject to a corrupt practice that could end up with an unfair transfer of the land? Why would you argue that persons of Aboriginal heritage would need a protection today that wouldn't be needed by non-Aboriginal persons? And are you saying that this is something that needs to be in place forever? Or is this a transitory distinction that you see between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people?
I think we're evolving, quite frankly. But in terms of us, we took a huge step in terms of making our people independent and our council independent for that matter. But we're evolving, and the land question is going to take a little bit more involvement. Give you an example. Before I became chief councillor, it was blasphemous for a band council to go out and buy private land. Why should we buy our territory back? This is the mentality. And when it comes to land, there's so much lack of knowledge or understanding of the value of land. It's all our territory. 24,000 square kilometers, it's all ours. But, they don't understand, there's ownership within that territorial boundary. So when I had the opportunity to buy a chunk of property that was valued at $21 million for an LG development, but I had the idea in my head that I could maneuver a $3.5 million purchase, I got blocked by my council. I got blocked by my people. No, you're not going to take $5 million out of a bank account and buy this land. And it took me a while for them to convince them. And finally, I told everybody, look, guys, I guarantee you, if I buy this land, I will replace that money with profit. I guarantee you. I didn't know if it was going to work or not, but I just knew there was an LG company that was really interested in buying that company. And what I was saying was, if I own the property, I'll lease it to you under the current laws of BC, so it's a fair price, and under the rental conditions set by BC. And so that's the way I was envisioning this. Over 20 years, it's going to more than pay for itself. Well, after 2 years, and after $17 million paid to my band, the company just packed up and left. And then my people, my council said, wow, $3.5 million and you made 17 million? What else can we do? There's a chunk of property downtown that has the same type of opportunity. Let's go buy that one. Hey, there's another chunk of property over there. Let's go buy that one. Now the people are starting to say, hey, land, sure. Taxes, sure, why not? If you're going to bring in the money, go ahead, go for it. But I think this speaks to involvement, but the involvement really hasn't happened yet in terms of land ownership for the investment opportunity. And by the way, I've never come across a non-native in the situation that I'm talking about in terms of being taken advantage of.
Interesting. All right. Well, we've just touched on a special need that you've identified for Indigenous persons for protection from having their land alienated. Let's go the other end of a spectrum. What is it? And I'm going to combine two questions here. We have Stephen Clark, who is the head of a school in the Maritimes, asking the biggest question that we could anticipate tonight, which is, what does it mean to be a Canadian? Given all of the different distinctions, the diversity that we celebrate, is there some unifying definition that comes with being Canadian? And before you answer that, I'm deliberately throwing in another question, partly so you get a chance to think, but also because this other question, I think, affects it. And this is from Vivian Bromley, who was a school teacher, is a very civics-minded person who worked in the MP office when I was the MP and was famous for dealing with all sorts of communities and solving people's problems in one of 4 very busy offices that we ran. So Vivian asked the question, what do you think of the acronym UNDRIP for the resolution, United Nations Declaration Indigenous persons, which calls for free, prior, and informed consent before land can be developed in Canada, that is where there is a claim by First Nations community. I asked those questions together partly because we're running out of time, but I also asked those questions because I see the UNDRIP resolution as being very divisive in the long term, of being one more way of deepening the chasm when we ought to be moving towards a Canada 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, which is really governed by a universal law. But you may all have a different perspective on this. Can you grasp these two things and try and tackle them? To be really unfair to the person in the eastmost time zone, Joanna, we'll start with you. UNDRIP and what does it mean to be a Canadian?
Yeah, I'm afraid it might just be the late hour, but I don't have very substantive thoughts on either. UNDRIP is just, I need to study it more. I think my instincts may be aligned with yours, although I do think that there's a symbolic benefit to it. And I would hope that there would be some clarity and predictability around it as it's adopted in Canada, because one of the main problems with this country's jurisprudence on Indigenous Crown relations is that it's indecipherable. Basically, it's just they write a lot of pretty paragraphs, the Supreme Court of Canada, about what the honor of the Crown is and what the duty to consult is, and it's, you know, accepted by most legal scholars that it completely fails at the basic test of law to give clarity and predictability. But need to study more about that. As to what it is to be a Canadian, it's to desire and be willing to make your life here and build your destiny here, whatever that may be, to build a business, to build a family, to write 4 books, in the case of our friend Mark, and to support your neighbors and to stand shoulder to shoulder with others who are here to do the same thing. But I think one of the beautiful things about Canada is there's very few sort of like normative prescriptions. In the US, you kind of have to get with a certain program or you'll feel alienated. But I think in Canada, we have room for a number of different types of possibilities. And it's one of the things that makes this country great, in my opinion.
One of your gifts, Joanna, is as a constitutional scholar, you can actually articulate things in terms that people can understand who don't necessarily have any interest in the Constitution. So thank you for that. All right, Mark, your turn.
I would probably second what both of you have said. And again, with no offense to lawyers, and there appear to be plenty on the call.
You just counted a politician, so why not?
Yeah, UNDRIP may be a great gift to lawyers for the rest of their careers. So if past, examples or any guide to the future. Look, I think when it comes to though, what does it mean to be Canadian? That's been asked forever, but let me try and attack it from or answer it from a different perspective. I was reading, I think it was the historian Will Durant, Will and Ariel Durant, who produced like a 10-book series on civilization and history, starting in ancient Greece. And they made an observation, if my memory holds true here, about before the Roman Empire was in existence, Europe was kind of a patchwork of all sorts of nation states. And, you had to pay one person at a bridge something, you go down a road, you had to pay another person something. This was bad for a whole bunch of reasons. There was no commonality, no common citizenship, and there were no open borders. Ironically, when I hear sometimes people in Canada, whether it's with due respect to some in the province of Quebec, this is an issue that's been going on since at least René Lévesque, and some of the more, some of, not you, Ellis, when you talk about self-government, I have a much better sense that you're much more crystal clear and specific about what you mean. And you've said tonight again that you don't mean like splitting from Canada, like Quebec separatists. But my fear is that when I hear some First Nations leaders talk, they have a more radical, again, René Lévesque type notion of what it would mean to be a First Nation. So there's a lack of commonality and lack of open borders. And I've always thought this is very ironic. This was Europe before Rome took over. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I do think to be a successful nation state, there has to be some degree of unity at the core with the usual complement of diversity. But the devil is in the details.
All right, you started with a definition of Canada and then you ended with the devil. Okay, Ellis. Well, you get a chance to run at this. What is Canada, and how does the UNDRIP resolution affect your answer?
What is Canada? That's a question I've been asking for the last 5, 6 years. Because you remember, I come from reserve, and that's almost a different world into itself. We don't have the same rules as anybody living off reserve. And when I came into this job, the one thing I noticed, even before as chief counselor, I couldn't see any patriotism. You talk about hockey, yeah, you talk about curling maybe, but I couldn't really see it. Like, I come from a small community where I'm totally proud to be Haisla. I'm gonna fight everything I can. I'll pull tooth and nail into making sure my people get to a better place. So I come to the MLA's office and I think, well, I can do the same thing for BC. I can do the same thing for Canada. But Canadians don't have that burning patriotism like, say, an American. You talk down to an American, he's going to pull out his flag. He's going to wave it in your face and threaten you. Do that to Canadian, the Canadian's going to apologize to you. So what is a Canadian? I don't know. And so it doesn't surprise me when Canadians see their oil getting sold for discounts on the international market, because there's no real pride behind it. LNG is now going the same way. They're proposing to sell BC LNG down in the United States so they can sell it to Asia at a discount. There's no pride. I don't see any real identity. And here I am, an Aboriginal, saying, hey, who's going to stand up for Canada? How ironic is that? And anyway, in terms of UNDRIP, I never agreed with it when it first came in over 10 years ago. Chief Counselor never agreed with it. In fact, what I don't understand, Canada and BC, why do you want to put Canada back 40 years in terms of the progress that you made with First Nations? Believe it or not, Canada is very progressive when dealing with First Nations issues. When you look at other places around the world who actually are still abusing and excluding their Indigenous nations, Canada's done a really good job. You wouldn't have had peace in the woods in BC without Aboriginal rights and title case law. You wouldn't have had one LNG project in Kitimat without Aboriginal rights and title case law. And by the way, when you're looking at Aboriginal rights and title case law that sets down the rules for the honor of the Crown and all the First Nations, there has been just as many cases lost by First Nations as there was won, because the principles are set now and they're fair. And I agree, it's really hard to understand, but if you read the case law over and over and over, and your community has an understanding of where you want to take the community in terms of direction, and your lawyer understands the direction. I mean, not the other way around. Don't get into negotiation with a lawyer and let them lead negotiations. It's got to be based on your mandate. I mean, I don't understand why we took all that Aboriginal rights and title case law that was developed for the last 40 years and just threw it out the window and just said, let's start all over and let's start redefining what it means. You've already got a definition. Unfortunately, in BC, we're going to have to go right back to 40 years ago and try to define through the courts what does UNDRIP mean. And sad to say, I think Canada's next when they fully endorse UNDRIP at a national level.
Well, I thank each of you. And one thing that Ellis and Joanna and Mark, you all have in common, or you wouldn't be here tonight, you wouldn't be doing the things you're doing, is a great hope for our country. And I'm very keen on your words, Ellis. I mean, your suggestion that as moderates, as people who engage reason rather than fanaticism, why can't we be more passionate? Why can't we be more passionate as Canadians? Why can't we stand up for our country, be proud of our country, and just revel in the diversity? And I do believe there will come a day when First Nations and non-Indigenous persons will stand side by side, celebrating the differences, excited about the differences, the art, the culture, the language, wanting to protect one another's distinctiveness, but still aim for one universal law. Because whether you're Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King or any of the heroes of civil rights, ultimately it's the equality of opportunity that I believe gives a foundation for excellence and allows people to smile on one another, to work with one another, and not to feel that someone has some unfair advantage based on race, creed, color, or language. At any rate, I regret to say that this brings us to the end of our last episode, at least for this season of Things That Matter. And I wanted to leave everybody with a bit of a challenge, because I think if this has been of any use to anyone, it ought to have motivated us to do something. If not, then it's just talk. And I don't think people who come to meetings like this want to engage in just talk. So I hope that you will think towards this upcoming federal election and get involved. Do your homework. In my case, you can learn more about the things I believe and what I'm doing on my website, johnweston4mp.ca. Speak to someone on the campaign team that you're interested in joining. Learn how to volunteer. It might surprise you how your gifts and experience could be of value and how you might really enjoy the experience. Host a gathering. I'm eager to join people's Zoom gatherings or hopefully in-person gatherings. It's the only way I can meet your friends if you open the door for me to meet them. Spread the word. Let them know that there are actually candidates who care about ideas and want good ideas to win and want to surround themselves with great people like the guests that you've heard from this evening. And of course, donate. If you're interested in supporting a campaign in Canada, well, we have very generous tax credits and we have strong limits on how much you can donate, a huge difference from the situation in the United States. So with that, I want to thank each of you, Ellis, Joanna, Mark, for being with us this evening, audience members for joining us. And this will bring to a close at least this episode of Things That Matter.